The temperature at the edge of the Bois de Reedware on the morning of January 26, 1945, had dropped below 0 Fahrenheit overnight. The ground was frozen so hard that entrenching tools bounced off it like it was concrete. The snow was knee-deep across the open beet fields that stretched between the tree line and the village of Holtzwehr, 200 yards to the south. A man standing at the forest edge could see the village clearly. The stone farmhouses, the roads running out from either side, the flat, empty fields offering no cover in any direction. Second Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy stood at that edge and studied what was in front of him. He was 19 years old. He weighed about 145 pounds. He had been in Europe for more than a year, had fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the length of France, and had been wounded twice. Of the 120 men who had marched with Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment into the Holtzwehr Forest the night before, 18 remained able to fight. Every other officer in the company was dead or in a field hospital. Murphy was not supposed to be in command. He was not supposed to be here at all. A sniper had put a round through his hip 2 weeks earlier, and the wound had not fully healed. He had rejoined his unit anyway. The Army had no one else to send. If you're enjoying this deep dive into this story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. The mission that morning was straightforward in the way that only military orders can be straightforward when the situation behind them is anything but. Murphy and his 18 survivors were holed the southern edge of the forest overlooking Holtzwehr until reinforcements arrived. They could not dig foxholes in the frozen ground, so they scratched at the soil and piled what dirt they could in front of their positions. 2 M10 tank destroyers from Lieutenant Colonel Walter Tardy's 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived at dawn to support them. Murphy positioned 1 tank destroyer on his right flank and set up his command post in a drainage ditch 10 yards in front of the second. He ran a field telephone wire back to battalion headquarters, a mile to the rear. Then he waited. The Colmar Pocket was a name that meant nothing to most people back home, but to the men fighting inside it through January 1945, it meant everything that was still wrong with the war in Europe. By November the previous year, Allied forces had pushed the German armies back across most of France. The Wehrmacht had been beaten at Normandy, driven from Paris, hammered during the liberation of southern France. But in Alsace, in the eastern corner of France along the Rhine, a substantial German force had held its ground. Approximately 30,000 German soldiers remained in a semicircular bridgehead around the city of Colmar, a pocket of territory roughly 30 miles wide and 30 miles deep that the Germans refused to yield. From their positions, they threatened the Allied southern flank and blocked the approach to the Rhine itself. The Colmar Pocket was the last significant piece of French soil still held by Germany. The French government had been pressing for months for its liberation. General Dwight Eisenhower had been pressing as well, understanding that leaving this concentration of German troops in place while pushing into Germany proper created a dangerous vulnerability. In January of 1945, the decision was made to eliminate the pocket. The American 3rd Infantry Division, Murphy's division, was assigned the primary axis of advance. The 3rd Division was known within the Army as the Rock of the Marne, a nickname earned during the First World War that the men of 1945 wore with complicated pride. It was a hard division, experienced, with a casualty list that ran to the thousands. By January of 45, it had been in continuous combat for months. Companies that had started campaigns with 120 men were fielding 18. Officers who had led platoons were commanding companies. Men who had enlisted as privates were making decisions that colonels were supposed to make. The Army had not collapsed under these conditions. It had adapted to them. So had Audie Murphy. He had been born in Kingston, Hunt County, Texas. On the 20th of June, 1925, the 6th of 12 children born to Emmett and Josie Murphy. The family farmed cotton on land they did not own, sharecroppers in the agricultural economy of East Texas, which meant they worked hard and remained poor regardless of how hard they worked. Murphy's earliest memories were of hunger that was not quite severe enough to be starvation, of clothes that did not fit properly, of a father who was present but increasingly absent in the ways that mattered. Emmett Murphy walked away from the family for good in 1936, when Audie was 11 years old, leaving his wife and children to manage without him. What followed was not unusual for Texas in the Depression. Murphy dropped out of school in the 5th grade to work. He hired himself out as a farm laborer for $1 a day, chopping and picking cotton alongside men twice his age. He had taught himself to shoot with a slingshot and then with a rifle, and what he hunted was not sport. It was a difference between eating and not eating. Rabbits, squirrels, whatever you find in the scrub field around Celeste, Texas. He learned to shoot carefully because sometimes there was only one shell, and the first shot had to count. His mother, Josie, died in May of 1941. Murphy was 16. He placed his 3 youngest siblings in an orphanage because there was no other choice, and went to work in a radio repair shop in Greenville. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor that December, Murphy had already been carrying the weight of family for years. He walked into a recruiting office the following June, on the day he turned 17, and tried to enlist. The Marines turned him down. He was too short, 5'5", and too light. The paratroopers turned him down for the same reason. The Army took him after his older sister provided a sworn statement adding a year to his age. Basic training did not impress Murphy with its difficulty. The Army sent him to North Africa in February of 1943, where he was assigned to Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment. He was 18 years old and looked younger. His sergeant evaluated him as pleasant but unremarkable and tried to have him reassigned to a cook's position because he seemed too slight for combat. Murphy declined the reassignment. What followed, over the next 2 years, was a military record that the Army would eventually classify as the most decorated of any American soldier in the entire history of the war. He fought in Sicily and earned his first decorations. He fought at Anzio, where the Allied beachhead spent 4 months under continuous German pressure and survived when men around him did not. He fought through the liberation of Rome and into southern France, where his actions at a town called Clury earned him a battlefield commission to 2nd lieutenant. He was given command of a platoon, then of Company B when the company commander was killed. By January 1945, Murphy had been wounded twice, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Bronze Star, and the Legion of Merit. He had also buried more friends than he could easily count. The Colmar operation began on the 22nd of January, 1945. The 30th Infantry Regiment crossed the Eel River first and captured the Maison Rouge Bridge on the 23rd. But the bridge proved unable to support American tanks, and German forces from the 708th Volksgrenadier Division and the 280th Assault Gun Battalion counterattacked with devastating effect. Without armor support and unable to dig into the frozen ground, the 30th suffered severe casualties and was forced back across the river. The regiment was so badly mauled, it was pulled from the line for 3 days while it reorganized. The 15th Infantry Regiment went in next. American engineers had found a crossing point further north that could support armor, and with tank support the 15th pushed south through the Holtzwehr forest. The fighting was brutal. The Germans held well-prepared positions in the trees and defended every yard of ground. By midnight on January 25th, Company B had advanced 600 yards into the forest. Of 120 men who had entered the trees, 102 were dead or wounded. 18 remained. Murphy was the only officer left alive. The orders that arrived shortly after midnight were unambiguous. Take the remaining men to the southern edge of the forest, overlooking Holtzwehr. Hold the position until reinforcements arrive. Murphy assembled his 18 soldiers, explained what they were going to do, and led them through the dark trees to the forest edge. They arrived before dawn and spent the hours until first light trying to dig into ground that would not yield. The 2 M10 tank destroyers from the 601st Battalion arrived at daybreak, which was the first piece of good news anyone in Company B had received in days. The M10 was a tank destroyer built on a modified Sherman chassis, weighing about 30 tons. It mounted a 3-inch gun capable of penetrating most German tank armor at combat ranges, and it carried a 50 caliber machine gun on the top of its open turret. The machine gun was there for anti-aircraft defense and for engaging infantry. The main gun was there for tanks. Murphy positioned 1 M10 on his right flank to protect that approach and set up his command post near the 2nd. Company A linked up loosely on his left. By 8 in the morning, the position was as organized as it was going to be. Murphy got on the field telephone and checked in with battalion headquarters. He was told reinforcements were coming. He settled in to wait. They came at 2 in the afternoon. Not the reinforcements. The Germans. At approximately 1400 hours on January 26, Murphy was in his drainage ditch command post when movement in Holzwehr caught his attention. 6 German tanks were moving out of the village, advancing north across the snow-covered beet fields directly toward the forest edge where Company B was positioned. Behind the tanks came the infantry, an estimated 250 German soldiers, advancing in open formation across terrain that offered no cover. Murphy counted the tanks and the infantry, made a rapid assessment of what his 18 men could do against this force, and got on the field telephone to battalion headquarters. He called for artillery support. He was told the request was being processed. The German artillery opened up before the infantry reached the halfway point across the field. Shells began landing along the forest edge, churning up frozen dirt and splinters of wood. The advanced M10 tank destroyer tried to maneuver into a better firing position, slid on the icy ground, and dropped into a ditch that left its main gun at an angle from which it could not engage the advancing tanks. The rear M10, the one near Murphy's command post, brought its gun to bear and fired. The 90mm round struck the German tanks and failed to penetrate. The armor was too thick at the engagement ranges available. The machine guns, the 30 caliber and the 50, proved effective against the German infantry and cut down soldiers advancing across the open ground. But the tanks kept coming. One of the tanks fired at the rear M10. The 88mm round hit the tank destroyer squarely, killing the commander and the gunner and setting the vehicle on fire. The remaining crew bailed out. The ammunition inside the burning M10 began to cook off, throwing rounds in random directions, making the area around the vehicle lethal. Murphy's company machine gun crew took casualties. The 18 men of Company B, already reduced to 18, lost more of their number to German fire. Murphy looked at what remained and made a decision. He got on the radio and told his men to fall back into the forest. 18 men could not hold the edge against 6 tanks and 250 infantry without armor support or artillery. Falling back was tactically sound. Falling back was what any reasonable officer would have ordered. Murphy told his soldiers to go. They went. Murphy himself started to follow. Then he stopped. The burning M10 was 30 yards away, the 50 caliber machine gun still mounted on its open turret. The German infantry was still advancing across the field. His company was in the trees behind him, alive, moving. But the moment Company B lost fire superiority at the forest edge, the Germans would be able to advance the trees and everything behind that tree line, the battalion headquarters, the supply routes, the approaches to the American rear, would become exposed. Murphy understood this the way that men understand things in combat when they've been doing it long enough that it moves faster than conscious thought. He ran toward the burning tank destroyer. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The M10 was fully ablaze. Flames were coming from the engine compartment. The ammunition inside continued to cook off intermittently, sending rounds snapping overhead. The vehicle could have exploded at any moment. Tank destroyer ammunition, gasoline, the machine gun's own belts of 50 caliber rounds, all of it burning together in a vehicle that had been designed for combat, but not for the kind of heat that was now consuming it from the inside. Murphy climbed up onto the hull. He reached the 50 caliber machine gun and swung it toward the German infantry, still advancing across the field. He checked the ammunition belt. It was loaded and opened fire. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was a weapon that had been in American service since 1933. A heavy machine gun that fired a round roughly half an inch in diameter at a rate of 4 to 500 rounds per minute. At the ranges Murphy was engaging, 100 yards, 200 yards across open, flat ground. It was devastating against infantry in the open. The German soldiers who had been advancing steadily across the beet fields began to drop. Those who survived dug for ground, looking for cover in terrain that offered none. The field was flat and white and offered no concealment. Murphy traversed a gun, fire-controlled bursts, shifted to new targets, fired again. The German infantry had expected the American position to be abandoned. They had watched the M10 get hit, watched the Americans fall back into the trees, and had begun moving across the open ground with the confidence of men who believed the immediate threat had been neutralized. What they encountered instead was a single man on a burning vehicle who had no apparent intention of stopping. The German tanks began firing at Murphy's position. They could see the muzzle flashes from the .50 caliber gun. They could see the lone figure on top of the burning destroyer. Several tank rounds landed near the M10 or passed over it. Murphy stayed on the gun. The flames around him grew. The heat became intense. He leaned into the gun and kept firing. He was simultaneously working the field telephone. In between firing bursts at the German infantry, he was relaying coordinates to the artillery forward observers behind him, calling in fire missions on the German positions. He was working 2 jobs at once, killing infantry with a machine gun and directing artillery that might reach the tanks. His voice on the telephone, recalled by the men who heard it, was steady. He described what he could see. He gave corrections when shells landed short or wide. He stayed on the telephone, and he stayed on the gun. The artillery began to arrive. Shells started landing in the open field, among the German infantry and around the tanks. The combination of Murphy's machine gun fire from directly in front of them and artillery falling among them began to break the German assault's momentum. The infantry took more casualties and began to lose cohesion. The tanks, which could not be hurt by the .50 caliber but could be bracketed by artillery, began to maneuver, changing position to avoid the fall of rounds. Murphy fired a machine gun for approximately 1 hour. He killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers. He directed artillery fire that killed or wounded more. The German assault, which had begun in organized fashion with 6 tanks and 250 infantry advancing across open ground against a position defended by 18 exhausted Americans, ground to a halt in the snow and then began to fall back toward Holzwehr. The burning M10 had never exploded. The fire had continued burning throughout the engagement. The heat severe enough that Murphy's leg was wounded by shrapnel at some point during the hour. Accounts differ on exactly when, but not severely enough to force him off the gun. He stayed until the German assault had broken and was withdrawing. Then he climbed down from the burning vehicle and walked back into the trees. Company B was still there. The 18 men who had retreated into the forest when Murphy ordered them back had reorganized and were prepared to fight if the Germans had reached the tree line. They had not reached it. Murphy had made certain of that. When he walked back into the forest, one of the survivors asked if he was hurt. Murphy said he had been nicked in the leg. He asked about the men. The survivors reported in. Company B had held the forest edge. The German assault had been repelled. Murphy got on the field telephone and reported the situation to battalion headquarters. He asked again about reinforcements. He was told they were coming. A medical officer found him shortly afterward and looked at the leg wound. Murphy was evacuated for treatment. He refused to leave his company permanently and was back with the unit within days, despite the wound. He had been wounded 3 times now in the span of 2 weeks. The Medal of Honor citation for Audie Leon Murphy was approved on June 2, 1945, by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding general of the 7th Army. The ceremony was held near Salzburg, Austria, in the final weeks after Germany's surrender. Murphy stood at attention while the citation was read aloud. It described the events at Holzwehr in the formal language of military commendation, each sentence cataloging another action that the Army had concluded exceeded the ordinary expectations of duty. The citation read, in the relevant portion, that Murphy had mounted the burning tank destroyer with no regard for his own safety, manned the machine gun against the advancing enemy, and maintained his position for approximately 1 hour, while the vehicle was threatened with explosion at any moment. It noted that he killed or wounded approximately 50 of the enemy. It noted that his directing of artillery fire wiped out many more. It concluded that his indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and certain death, and that his actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. The decoration placed around Murphy's neck that day was a Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can award to any member of its armed forces. It was the 33rd award Murphy had received during the war. His full list included the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars with an oak leaf cluster, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with AV device for valor, 3 Purple Hearts, and 5 French and Belgian decorations, including the French Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre with Palm. He had earned every available American Combat Valor decoration of the era. He had done so while fighting in 9 major campaigns across 5 countries, over approximately 3 years of nearly continuous service. He was still 20 years old when the war in Europe ended. Life magazine ran his photograph on the cover of its July 16, 1945 issue. The caption read, "Most Decorated Soldier." The photograph showed a young man who looked like he belonged in a high school classroom, a round, freckled face, a slight frame, a uniform that seemed almost too large a body inside it. The face in the photograph did not look like the face of a man who had killed more than 240 German soldiers, had been wounded 3 times, had led men in combat through battles that reduced companies to handfuls of survivors. It looked like a boy. That disconnect between appearance and record would follow Murphy for the rest of his life. He returned to the United States in June of 1945 to a reception that he found bewildering and uncomfortable. There were parades, there were speeches, there were banquets and ceremonies and requests for interviews. Murphy attended what protocol required him to attend and said as little as he could manage. He had not processed what had happened to him over the previous 3 years. He was not certain he knew how. The things that had happened in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France were not things that translated into the language required at dinners with senators. They were not things he wanted to translate. He slept badly. He kept a pistol by the bed. Loud noises brought him out of sleep and back into states of alertness that served no purpose in peacetime. He had nightmares that he did not describe in detail to anyone for years. The Army called this condition battle fatigue, which was a term that suggested exhaustion and implied recovery. Murphy was not simply tired. Something more fundamental had been altered in the years he had spent moving toward German positions and watching the men beside him die. In the language that would eventually be developed to describe it accurately, he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1945, there was no language for it at all. The transition to civilian life that the Army expected of him was not a transition Murphy was equipped to make. He had no education beyond the 5th grade. He had no trade skills beyond farming and killing. He had Medal of Honor, 33 decorations, and a name that appeared in newspaper headlines. And none of those things helped him find work in the economy of post-war America. He was offered a position with the Veterans Administration, which he declined. He tried farming again, which did not pay. He was broke in ways that made his childhood poverty feel familiar. The film director James Cagney, who had met Murphy after seeing his photograph on a Life magazine cover, invited him to come to Hollywood. Cagney believed the young Texan had the quality that cameras found, an authenticity that could not be manufactured. Murphy was skeptical. He had no acting experience, no particular interest in performance, and a powerful aversion to the kind of attention that Hollywood generated. He went anyway, because the alternatives were worse. The early years were difficult. His first roles were small, his performances uncertain, his discomfort in front of cameras visible to the directors who worked with him. He was given westerns, which suited him better than anything else because they required the kind of stillness and economy of movement that combat had taught him. You did not move unless you had to. You did not speak unless it mattered. The westerns of the 1950s valued exactly those qualities. Murphy made 44 films across his acting career, and while he was never regarded as a great actor in the classical sense, he was authentic in a way that audiences responded to. There was something behind his eyes in those films, a weight that professional actors study for years and still could not convincingly manufacture. Murphy had not studied for it. He had simply lived it. The film that defined him came in 1955. To Hell and Back was an adaptation of Murphy's own memoir, published in 1949, which had become a best-selling account of his wartime service written with the help of a collaborator named David McClure. The book was direct and relatively unsparing. Murphy had not written it to glorify himself, and the memoir's honesty about fear, exhaustion, and loss was evident throughout. Universal Pictures purchased the rights and cast Murphy in the lead role, a decision that was unusual and somewhat controversial. You did not typically ask a man to reenact the worst experiences of his own life on a soundstage in California. Murphy did it. He recreated the battles he had fought, the men he had watched die, the specific engagements, including Holtzwehr, that had made him famous. The film became one of Universal's biggest commercial successes of the decade, eventually surpassing even Dracula on the studio's all-time earnings list, a position it will hold for many years. Audiences filled theaters across the country to watch a slight Texas farm boy climb a burning tank and hold off an infantry assault in the snow. They did not know, watching the film, that the man they were watching had not fully recovered from what he was reenacting. They saw the heroism. They did not see what came home with it. The nightmares continued. The sleeplessness continued. Murphy had developed a dependency on sleeping pills in the years after the war, a medication called Placidil that was prescribed for the insomnia that had become chronic. He recognized the dependency for what it was and eventually locked himself in a motel room for a week and withdrew from the medication without medical assistance. He described this period as one of the worst experiences of his life, which was a remarkable statement from a man who had survived Holtzwehr. He came through it the same way he had come through everything, by refusing to stop. That stubbornness, what had kept him on a burning tank destroyer for an hour in January 1945, was the same quality that got him to the motel room. It was useful in combat. In peacetime, it was a harder thing to carry because there was no clear enemy and no clear moment when the fight was over. He spoke about what he was experiencing in terms that were unusual for the era. Veterans of the Second World War were broadly expected to return home, resume their lives, and not discuss the war except in the most general and heroic terms. The dominant cultural narrative of the 1950s did not accommodate men who came home from the most righteous war in American history and could not sleep, could not stop reliving what they had seen, could not reconcile the man they had become in Europe with a civilian they were expected to be in Texas or California. Murphy refused this silence, not with the dramatic public advocacy that would come later, but in quieter ways. He talked to journalists. He talked to other veterans. He said that battle fatigue was real, that it did not resolve on its own, and that the men who were suffering from it deserved medical attention, rather than the polite suggestion that they straighten up and carry on. What made his advocacy different from the silence that surrounded him was precisely that he was willing to name his own experience. He was not speaking abstractly about other veterans and their difficulties. He was describing what happened to him when a car backfired on a Los Angeles street, or he woke at 3 a.m. unable to locate himself in time and place for several terrible seconds. He was describing what it cost him to sit in a restaurant with his back to the room. He was a man who had been on the cover of Life magazine and had testified before his own nervous system every day since 1945, and he was not willing to pretend otherwise simply because the culture demanded it. In a decade when American masculinity was defined in significant part by what men did not say about their own pain, Murphy kept saying it. In 1966, he wrote an open letter to Congress arguing for the establishment of better mental health programs for veterans. The letter was specific about what he himself had experienced. It described the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to fully detach from a state of combat readiness that had no appropriate outlet in peacetime. He was not writing as a celebrity making a public gesture. He was writing as a man who had spent 20 years trying to understand what happened to him and had concluded that the failure was not his. It was a failure of the system that sent men into combat and then provided them no means of reintegrating when the combat was over. The response to the letter was limited. Congress did not immediately establish the programs Murphy had requested. The term post-traumatic stress disorder would not appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1980, 9 years after Murphy's death. What Murphy was describing in 1966 was not yet formally classified as a medical condition. It was simply the experience of men who had fought. His letter was filed. The hearings he had hoped it would generate did not materialize. He kept writing and kept talking anyway, because that was what he did. He stayed on the gun until there was nothing left to shoot at. His financial life followed an arc that was painful and not uncommon among men who had acquired sudden celebrity without the background to manage it. The money from Hollywood was real, and Murphy spent it in ways that did not preserve it. He invested badly in horse breeding and real estate schemes that did not pay off. He gambled, a habit that he had difficulty controlling. By the late 1960s, he was in serious debt. He was owed royalties from the Hell and Back that the studio had contested for years through legal maneuvering that Murphy lacked the resources to fully challenge. He had made millions, and he had very little of it. The farm boy from Hunt County who had never had money did not know how to hold on to it when it arrived, and the people around him were not always honest about their intentions. His widow would spend more than 3 decades after his death paying off what he owed, working as a patient liaison at a Veterans Administration hospital in California, which was in its own way a kind of tribute. The woman who had loved him spending her working life in the institution he had spent as trying to improve. He had married twice. His first marriage, to actress Wanda Hendricks in 1949, lasted less than 2 years. His second marriage, to Pamela Archer in 1951, lasted the rest of his life. They had 2 sons, Terry and James. Murphy named the older boy after the friend in whose gym he had slept during the lean early years in Hollywood, a gesture that said something about what he valued and what he remembered. The family lived in Van Nuys, California, in a house that was smaller and plainer than the Hollywood address that Murphy's career might have suggested. He continued making films through the 1960s. The westerns that had made him popular in the 50s were giving way to a different kind of cinema, and the roles available to Murphy were not always commensurate with his actual reputation. He took what was offered. He needed the work. He was in his mid-40s, and the face that Life magazine had put on its cover in 1945 was now lined and weathered, and the film industry had found other faces. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a small private aircraft near Martinsville, Virginia, traveling to a business meeting in Roanoke. The aircraft flew into deteriorating weather near Brush Mountain. The pilot attempted to navigate through low cloud and fog and did not succeed. The plane struck the mountain. Everyone aboard was killed. Murphy's body was recovered 2 days later, on Memorial Day, which was a kind of coincidence that resists any description that does not seem forced. He was 45 years old. The Army buried him at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971, with full military honors. A rifle salute, the flag folded and presented, the ceremony that the country reserves for its own. He is buried in Section 46, and his grave is the second most visited in the cemetery after John F. Kennedy's. That fact tells you something about what Murphy represents to the people who seek him out, not the film actor, not the celebrity, but the man from Hunt County who had not enough food and not enough schooling, and went anyway, and did what he did. The things Murphy had asked for in his letters and conversations and interviews across the 1950s and 60s eventually came. The Veterans Administration expanded its mental health programs. Post-traumatic stress disorder received its formal diagnostic classification in 1980. Treatment protocols were developed. Veterans from Vietnam and subsequently from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had access to resources that Murphy's generation did not. Murphy did not live to see this. He had asked for it for 2 decades, and the acknowledgement came after he was gone. The programs that today help hundreds of thousands of veterans navigate the distance between who they were in combat and who they are asked to be afterward owe something, in their institutional history, to men like Murphy who refused to stay quiet when quiet was what was expected of them. What happened at Holtzware on January 26, 1945, is documented in enough detail that the basic facts are not seriously disputed. 6 German tanks and approximately 250 infantry advanced across an open snow field toward a forest position held by 18 exhausted American soldiers. The American lieutenant in command ordered his men to fall back. Then, on his own, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and engaged the German infantry with a 50 caliber machine gun for approximately 1 hour, while directing artillery fire by field telephone. The German assault was broken. The men of Company B reached safety. Murphy climbed down from the burning vehicle and walked back into the trees. The things that cannot be fully explained by the facts are the things worth thinking about. The M10 did not explode. The ammunition cooking off inside the hull continued to fire randomly without triggering a catastrophic detonation. The German tanks, which could have driven to the edge of the burning vehicle and destroyed it with a single round, did not. Murphy was wounded in the leg at some point during the engagement, a wound that did not stop him from operating the machine gun or the telephone. He stayed on the gun until the assault was over. He was asked many times in later years why he had climbed onto the burning M10. The question was phrased different ways by different journalists and interviewers over the 2 decades of his post-war life, but the underlying question was always the same. Why did you do that? Murphy's answers were characteristically brief. He had seen the machine gun. The machine gun needed to be used. He had used it. He did not construct elaborate explanations of courage or duty or sacrifice. He had grown up in a world where you did what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. He had been doing that since he was 11 years old, feeding his brothers and sisters on what he could hunt, working for $1 a day in someone else's fields. The burning M10 was simply the next thing that needed to be done, and he was the person standing closest to it. That formulation is too simple to be entirely satisfying, and it is probably as close to the truth as we're going to get. The man who climbed onto that tank destroyer was not performing valor. He was not calculating odds or constructing a narrative about himself. He was doing what 19 years of poverty, responsibility, lost combat, and training had made him capable of doing. He moved toward the problem because that was what he had always done. He killed over 240 German soldiers in the course of the war. He was wounded 3 times. He was credited with wounding and capturing many more enemy soldiers beyond those he killed. He earned 33 decorations. He commanded units that were shattered and held them together. He directed artillery fire under conditions that would have paralyzed most men. He did all of this while carrying the psychological damage of years in combat, damage he recognized and named and asked his country to take seriously, and which his country did not take seriously until he was gone. The Life magazine cover photograph from July of 1945 still exists. The boy in the photograph was real. The things he had done were real. The things he was carrying, invisible in the photograph, the nightmares and the sleeplessness and the years of difficulty ahead of him, were equally real. The country that put him on its magazine covers and sent him to parades and made a movie about him was not prepared to look at the second part of that story in 1945 or 1955 or 1965. Murphy kept trying to make it look. He was not entirely successful in his own lifetime, but the conversation he forced into the open about what combat does to the men who survive it has not stopped since he started it. That may be the most important thing he did. Not Holtzwehr, not the 33 decorations, not the 44 films. The fact that he came home and refused to be quietly heroic about what it cost. The field outside Holtzwehr is quiet now. The beet fields stretch in the same direction they have always stretched, flat and open, from the edge of the Bois de Reedweir to the village that stands unchanged in its essentials. There is a monument at the site. If you walk to the tree line and look south, you are standing approximately where Audie Murphy's Drainage Ditch Command Post was located on the morning of January 26, 1945. The frozen ground that his men could not dig into is soft in spring now, hard again in winter, the same ground it has always been. The burning tank destroyer is long gone. The 50 caliber machine gun is gone. The German infantry who advanced across that field and did not return are gone. What remains is a documented record of what one 19-year-old from Hunt County, Texas, did on one January afternoon, and the more difficult record of what that same man spent the rest of his life trying to communicate to a country that was still learning how to listen. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.